Okay, so let's pick up with the confirmation bias. So, in our normal way of thinking about the world, in our normal cognitions, we think much differently than we should be doing when we're doing scientific thinking. In our normal cognitions, it's perfectly fine for us to walk around looking for evidence that supports our beliefs. I mean, that's how we set up our moral compass. That's how we decide right from wrong or what we want to vote for or not. I mean, that's normal. That's perfectly fine. In our normal everyday life, we look for evidence that supports our beliefs and we ignore or run screaming away from or argue with anyone who tries to refute our beliefs, right? That's normal. In normal cognition, we want to be right, and we want evidence that proves that we're right in our normal cognition. When we're working scientifically, though, we have to suspend that kind of cognition. We have to think scientifically in order to be good scientists who are doing true work. So we have to reverse, we have to flip everything. We have to seek evidence that refutes our beliefs, that falsifies our beliefs, that shows us that our beliefs are incorrect. We have to look for that evidence. We have to set up our tests in such a way that the evidence can show us we're wrong. We have to be suspicious. We have to suspect any evidence that does support our beliefs. It's, I got to tell you, really gratifying when you collect data, you run your statistic, it shows you that your data is supporting your hypothesis. It's really gratifying. You're like, yay, it's so awesome to be right. But you know what? A, you're not right. You're just not wrong yet. And B, the first thing you have to think is, okay, is there anything that I've done that stacked the deck or was non-scientific or imprecise? We have to be suspicious of our own data, let alone the results that other people have produced that we didn't have control over and things like that. We have to be suspicious of evidence that supports our beliefs. We have to remember that we're never seeking to prove a hypothesis or a theory. You can never prove them. All you can do is not disprove them. There's always the possibility that the key piece of evidence that would show us that the hypothesis or the theory is wrong is out there waiting to be found, and that we just haven't found it yet. So you always have to be braced for the possibility that, new technology or new eyes or something would allow us to see, oh, there's that piece of evidence, we were completely wrong the whole time. So you always have to be ready for that. So how does science avoid the confirmation bias? First thing we do is we are willing to admit our errors when we make them. We send our studies to be peer reviewed. We publish our results so that other people can look at them. Because a lot of times when a person who doesn't have any invested interest in the study looks at it, they realize they can see the mistakes, they can see the shortcomings, they can see the faulty interpretations. Another really important aspect of science is that when another researcher sees your study, the first instinct they should have is to try it themselves, to replicate, to see if they can get the same outcome. I just read a really interesting blurb about a conference presentation involving cell phones, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm trying that. So I've already got the IRB thing in the works, and we are going to replicate that study because it sounded really interesting. That's what science does, is it makes other people want to see if it'll work for them also. If the replication is a successful replication and it produces the same outcome as the original study did, it provides additional support for the original study. But it doesn't matter how many replications are done and how many test after test after test keep supporting a hypothesis. We never say proven. If you write proven in your exams, I put a big red line through it. It's like, don't say proven. Okay, now this was an interesting little blurb that was in Discover magazine. It was in their top 20 or 25 stories of the year. Einstein was right after all. They should not have used the word right. He was not wrong after all, is what that should say. This is actually really interesting because I don't know if you guys are familiar with the particle accelerator that's over in Europe. In 2011, they announced that neutrinos seem to be traveling faster than light, which would violate Einstein's theory of relativity. And they came to that conclusion because the neutrinos were showing up at a detector 60 nanoseconds sooner than expected. Everybody was super excited, like, oh, Einstein was wrong, theory of relativity is out, blah, blah, blah. But then last February, well, this is from like 2013, physicists located a faulty cable that produced mistimed measurements. So now Einstein was right? No. Einstein isn't wrong yet. We have not produced evidence that has falsified Einstein's prediction. That doesn't mean he was right. That evidence might still be out there lurking around waiting for us to find it. But for now, with this particle accelerator, he's not wrong yet. The thing that was wrong was, you gotta love the faulty cable. Classic. So yeah, we gotta avoid words like proven or right. One of my students used the term vindicated when we were talking about whether our replication would produce the same outcome that the original study had. And they're like, then we would vindicate the original researcher. Well, no, we just would have evidence that supports them. So the correct phrasing probably should have been wasn't wrong. You can see why that wouldn't be a headline though, right? Einstein wasn't wrong after. Yeah, that's a little cumbersome. Okay. So what I'm trying to encourage in you is a healthy skepticism, where you're always wondering, is that all the data there is? Was there some kind of bias in the way the data was collected? That kind of thing. This is different from naysaying. Skepticism tells us that we should follow Occam's razor. If you launch this little piece, it's a little clip from The Simpsons. So it's very brief, and it's Lisa explaining Occam's razor. Occam explained Occam's razor by saying one should not increase beyond what is necessary the number of entities required to explain anything. Seems kind of cumbersome for admonition to keep things simple, right? But a simpler way of phrasing it was introduced, called the principle of parsimony, that says one should choose the simplest explanation of a phenomenon. That's still kind of cumbersome compared to maybe the simplest way to phrase it, which is the simplest explanation should be assumed to be true. Let's apply Occam's razor to Freudian theory. Poor Freud, I'm sorry. Okay, so hopefully you guys are all familiar with the Oedipal complex, or conflict, depending on how you want to call it, where the little boy supposedly falls in love with his mom, wants to kill his father, yada yada, blah blah. Ultimately, supposedly through castration anxiety, he decides to repress his feelings of lust and his feelings of animosity, and instead identify with his dad so he can become like his dad. Okay, now when a person hears about the Oedipal conflict, a lot of times they go, no way, I never felt like that about my mom, I never wanted to kill my dad, what are you talking about? Well, Freud will take an entity called repression and say, well, you just place that into your unconscious where it's no longer accessible. So that's why you think you don't remember it. It really happened, you just think you don't remember it. And then if you say, no, I'm pretty sure I'd remember something like that, he'll invoke something else that's pretty mysterious and say, well, you're just in denial. You're just unwilling to accept the truth. He's not following Occam's razor with these magical, unconscious, unmeasurable, unverifiable instances of things that he thinks we're doing. He's making it more complex. So that's yet one more reason why Freud isn't considered that scientific. He doesn't follow Occam's razor, or the principle of parsimony, or however you want to call it. So skepticism says the simplest explanation should be assumed to be true. Whenever we're looking at something like Bigfoot, let's use that as one of our conspiracy theories. So there's a Bigfoot. Okay. The simplest explanation is that somebody would have to have found a Bigfoot body by now. Somebody, all these people walking around the woods, hunting and stuff like that. We got so much encroachment into the forest with homes and with people harvesting the trees, and there'd have to have been a body found by now, right? How do we keep having these little glimpses and no body ever found? The simplest explanation is that it's probably tricks being played with people's eyes and the shadows. That's the simplest explanation. That doesn't mean I'm naysaying. That doesn't mean that if somebody produced a body, that I'd still look at that body and say, I don't believe it. That's naysaying. Naysaying is when you refuse to accept evidence that runs counter to your beliefs. Skepticism says, I need to be cautious about my interpretation of the meaning of this data. Now, I've got a link here to James Randi, and he does a great job of showing how skeptics can think about paranormal claims and stuff like that. It's only like a 6-minute video. It's on YouTube, so if you give it a click, there are a couple of really interesting things about skepticism, and then there's also pretty classic pieces from like The Tonight Show where they're all sitting there smoking on set. It's pretty funny. Classic, sort of blast from the past kind of stuff. But if you check him out, he's a classic skepticist, classic skeptic. He is not just naysaying to be disagreeable. He's saying, show me the evidence. We need to have control over the variables and see if the outcome can still be produced. And that's the thing that we really want to focus on in science. Okay, what we want to avoid is reification of hypotheses. Let's see where I am. Okay, let me finish this up, even though this is a longer than usual video, just so I can get it done with. So, what we want to avoid, we want to be skeptical, not naysayers, and we want to avoid what's called reification of hypotheses. Reification means when we take something abstract, like a concept, and we treat it like it's a material thing, something real. Like a hypothesis is not a real thing. It's a prediction. It's not something that you can see or smell or taste. It's a prediction, right? But sometimes we fall in love with our hypotheses and we treat them as though they're something real and that they really mean something. And when we do that, it causes us to do little subtle non-scientific things like fail to set up proper falsification. I think we could all agree that Freud was in love with his own theory, and he really didn't want any attempts to falsify his theory. In fact, his followers who attempted to, broaden his theory or root it more in the scientific field were basically dismissed from his presence for having the nerve to attempt to falsify any of his claims. That's what happens when you fall in love with your theory. You ignore contrary evidence. If you're completely invested and completely believe your own hype, you're going to come to the conclusion that contrary evidence is all faulty, but you can completely trust the evidence that's supporting your beliefs. When we do have evidence that's kinda indicating that our hypothesis is supported, we'll go ahead and bolster it up a little bit to make it even more firmly supportive. And we'll reassure ourselves, well, that's okay, I just threw out a couple of outliers, or, that person wasn't, I don't think they were performing as well as they could have, so I added a couple of points to their score or something. That's what we do when we've put blinders on and we've focused so heavily on the goal of being right and, treated our hypothesis like it's something real. The reason why we don't want to treat our hypothesis like it's something real, we don't want to reify our hypothesis, is because all knowledge is provisional. Scientists are completely aware, that good scientists are aware that whatever their study produced, this is what we know for now. My next study might show me that that was wrong. So scientists use provisional language. We say things like, this data indicates, or with this sample our findings reveal. And they're very careful about the limitations of what you should be able to draw from their conclusions. They realize that replications might refute their results. And so this is what I found in my lab with these participants. But you in your lab, with a different set of participants, might come to a completely different conclusion. So scientists are very aware that they might be shown that they're wrong. A study that caught my attention back in 1993 was reported all over the news at the time. It was on Good Morning America and those kinds of shows all over the place, that there was a higher risk of prostate cancer among men who had had vasectomies. And I remember back in 1993 people talking about, well, should men get their vasectomies reversed? What is this? What's going on? I only pulled 2 of the follow-up studies that showed no association at all between vasectomy and prostate cancer. There's been study after study, replication after replication, that has shown that something odd was present in the Giovannucci study that produced the outcome that he got. No one else has gotten that finding. Knowledge is provisional. Giovannucci motivated people to collect data on the topic that they probably hadn't been motivated to do before, but nobody else found what he found. And that's the important thing. We have to be aware that whatever we find is just the current finding. It's not the be all end all, and we should all go get our vasectomies reversed or whatever, right? We can't reify those hypotheses. Okay, so key terms from this chapter: falsification, right? We want to set up our hypotheses in such a way that we can find out if they are incorrect. That data could show us that our hypothesis is not supported. So when you go to do your weekly exercise 2, keep that in mind, that falsifying means that we can be shown that we're wrong. And we want that in a good scientific hypothesis. We want the capability of revealing if we're wrong. Okay, so that's the spirit of this chapter. All right, I'll talk to you guys in my next video.